Okay, it's 12 noon, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Gary. This is Tanya Elliott and John Christensen, and on behalf of MyLVAD Journal Club, we welcome you to this presentation. Gary Liska is going to be sharing the results of the STABLE trial, and he is the Global Director in the Clinical Development and Education Department and Scientific Affairs Department at Alere. He's been working in the area of anticoagulation for 25 years and most recently has co-authored 2 peer-reviewed journal articles on the topic. We're very interested in welcoming Gary and hearing about the STABLE study because all our patients require just pretty careful anticoagulation. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be with you. And today's topic is one we're obviously very familiar with. The drug is 60 years old this year. So while there's a lot of answered questions about their drug, there remain some very important unanswered questions that directly relate to patient safety. So if you can go to the next slide, the focus of today will be primarily around the STABLE study and how it relates to changes in the treatment management of that. So, John, I've got the journal slide on my screen. I may be the only one, but if I'm not, then we need to advance to the...
Yep. Tanya, can you comment? I have the other slide on my screen. Can you comment?
Hi. What I'm seeing right now says objectives for today's information.
Yep. Okay, Gary.
All right, I'm not seeing that, so what I'm going to do is go to my presentation here, just so we can align ourselves with that.
Yep. And we are on slide 3.
Okay. Do that with you just for a sec. Okay, is that the objective for today's information?
Correct.
Okay, very good. We have 3 primary objectives for the 20 to 25 minutes. I'll provide information for you today. Number 1 is to gain an appreciation for stroke, not only in the U.S., but actually globally, and realize the impact economically it has for what's come to be known as not optimally managing warfarin, and what those costs are to the U.S. specifically and then the global, as well as some of the latest treatment options, not only warfarin, but some of the newer and where they may or may not come into play. The primary objective for today is to better understand the STABLE study. This is a landmark study. It's the largest study ever conducted with patient self-testing. And we'll discuss the objectives of the study design, and most importantly, what the outcome is of that peer-reviewed journal, American Journal of Managed Care, that published the study findings. Finally, we're to learn the approach that we have tentative planned with CMS for current reimbursement, but more importantly, what the future of reimbursement may look like, and hopefully that would include as well. So you go to the next slide. The global impact of stroke, and we can go to the next slide there, which is a shot globally of the incidence of stroke based on death per 100,000 patients age adjusted. I start with this slide because I think it's really important. Stroke remains the #1 cause of adult disability in the United States, which obviously is costly, and it gets people's attention that of Joint Commission, Medicare, FDA, that type. So it's the #1 cause of adult disability. But you can see, roughly speaking, where the U.S. comes in terms of incidence of stroke death per 100,000 patients, and we're relatively low. You can look at other countries that are in the moderate and the high range, and for some odd reason, Qatar has the lowest incidence of death due to stroke in the entire world, whereas the Marshall Islands have the highest incidence. So it's certainly not by landmass, if you will. So a lot has to do with utilization of proper medications for prevention. But I do put this up there for perspective to find out where the U.S. comes in terms of stroke incidence and mortality. And I think it's also interesting to look at the Netherlands, Sweden in particular, which is notorious for phenomenal management, and they always the net that always leads in terms of optimal time and target range, but they actually trail behind the U.S. in terms of stroke deaths per year. So a little bit of perspective there on some global incidents. And in Germany, ironically, is notoriously ahead in terms of patient self-testing, or specifically patient self-management, warfarin, but they too trail behind the U.S. in terms of stroke death per 100,000 patients. The next slide. You can see here in terms of putting this into financial perspective, for 1 out of every 19 deaths are attributed to stroke. So it remains a huge health epidemic problem, and it looks like 1 for every 4 minutes a patient suffers a fatality due to likely an ischemic stroke versus hemorrhagic stroke. You can see on the chart on the right that 87% of all strokes are ischemic, the thromboembolic strokes, versus 13% which are hemorrhagic. The bottom line, and this is a significant cost driver to the U.S., is $36.5 billion spent per year for stroke rehabilitation, short and long-term costs. The next slide. This introduces what we're here today for the most part, is the STABLE study overview. The STABLE study, STABLE is an acronym for self-testing analysis based on long-term experience. A little bit of history on patient self-testing. There have been no shortage of studies. There's been at least 20 studies, independent studies, on patient self-testing as it relates to time and target range and patient outcomes. But most of the studies have been relatively small, and they've been fairly short-term, as short as 3 to 6 months, as long as 18 months. So what we look to do with our database, and we have the world's largest database for INR registry of INR test results. We took it upon ourselves to identify a key opinion leader. That would be Jack Ansell, and we asked Jack to look at our data from a perspective of outcomes and see if there's a pattern of improved patient safety and outcomes, looking at some key end markers and outcomes. So if you can go to the next slide. This is a graphic. This is the American Journal of Managed Care that was published 3 months ago, almost today. And the study objectives for the STABLE study were to evaluate real-world patient self-testing versus that of controlled trials. This represents a new area for study, whereas real-world has never been compared to that of patient testing in controlled environments. So we felt as if we wanted to see if we could replicate the type of results that were published in other peer-reviewed journals under controlled trial situation. The crux of the study is really looking at testing frequency. And it's somewhat ironic that warfarin, while it's been around 60 years, it's always had this monthly testing standard of care and management. And if you look back in the literature and try to find out why was 4 weeks chosen for the standard of care for patient self-testing frequency, it goes all the way back to, of all things, administration. It was deemed way back when, before technology and transportation was available as it is today, that month testing was a realistic time frame for patients to get from A to B, get their labs done, and then back home again. So the monthly testing stigma that surrounds warfarin as the optimal or the standard of care for testing frequency really came about from an administrative and a practical standpoint. So not really reflective of the pharmacology of the drug, which has a 40-hour half-life in most cases. So we really look to challenge to see, that's like the diabetic model. If you test more frequently, will you have better control of the drug and better outcomes? So that was our primary objective in looking at the STABLE study data and to find out what impact testing frequency would have warfarin control. And we looked at very strict testing frequencies because that is a variable that can be very difficult to nail down with all the outpatient procedures starting and stopping the drug. There are strategies that actually reward patients for being in range by letting them test less frequently and then waiting till they get into trouble and then pulling them back into more frequent testing. So it seems illogical to do this, but there is that mindset behaviorally that this is a strategy that's employed by many clinics, that they give patients a long time before they either hang themselves or get into trouble, and then pull them back into what was perceived to be good practice. So that we wanted to challenge that strategy of treating good behavior with less testing frequency to see if that made a difference. And finally, we wanted to determine to see if age was a restrictive barrier. Warfarin utilization is estimated about 60% of eligible patients that could benefit. So there's still 40% out there that driving up those cost figures for stroke. That's $36.5 billion. So we want to determine that, is age truly a barrier, or is it a perceived barrier to patient safety on the drug? If you go to the next slide, please. The stable methods. We were 69,000 patients and data that represented each of those patients for over 3 million test results that we analyzed. I think the interesting thing with a real-world patients or study, the fact that patients came to us from all patient physician settings and care settings. This represented the most high-quality anticoagulation clinic settings, all the way down to usual care, mom-and-pop care, representing all regions of the United States. So there was really no bias as to where these patients came from, because certainly the higher quality genetic care centers have a much better control of drug and higher target and therapeutic range, whereas usual care can be as low as 50% or less time and target range. So we wanted to see if self-testing could be the great equalizer in terms of leveling the playing field of high-quality care and usual care, and just using the days in tests or testing frequency as that equalizer between those care settings to see if we could the quality playing field. Our endpoints were twofold. Number one was traditional time and target range using the Rosendahl method. So we averaged days between tests in between. And something that's relatively new to anticoagulation quality management is the incidence of critical values. Critical values being measured of INRs less than 1.5% and greater than 5%. And we'll have subsequent slides shortly that discuss the importance of what the incidence of adverse events are at those two extremes. And finally, I think this is also significant, that the study duration was 2.5 years, exceeded even the longest clinical trial of terms of length of patients studied for patient self-testing. We did have to lock into very strict structured testing frequency groups, and you can see there that weekly testing included between 5 and 9 days between test, and what we call a non-weekly test, 10 to 38 days. Realizing there's a huge bracket between there, but so many smaller fragments between that, biweekly, 3 times a month, monthly, and then out to 53 days. So a huge range. So we had to lock into, if patients were 83% time within those testing frequencies within the maroon box, they were considered within that testing frequency group. If you go to the next slide, this is just a graphic write-up study itself. It shares with you just the flow of the selection criteria. The exclusions, which I think were important, were the fact that patients that tested less than 50 days weren't really considered being able to connect one INR result to another with any clinical meaning, significance or meaning. And all patients that were less than 18 years of age, these were patients that were not indicated for use of the monitors. And also we want to make sure that there was a reasonable period of 6 months where patients had acceptable time to train on the monitor and get reliable results, so there was no bias in terms of usage of the monitor and comfort with the process of calling those test results in. So 6 months, post 6 months included those patients as well. So it came down to a fairly large variable testing of almost 25,000 patients and over 4,500 patients for the weekly testers. If you could go to the next slide, this is results by testing frequency. A huge, very positive outcome. The weekly testing frequency averaged a range of time and target range of 74% versus 68.7% for variable testers. While those numbers may be even a little close in the narrow therapeutic index of which warfarin falls in, that kind of differential is huge in terms of risk of events and adverse events. So a very significant finding that testing frequency did have a major impact on control of drugs. And the two other superimposed lines from the Bloomfield, which is a 21-patient study meta-analysis of self-testing, and the fifth trial, which was the VA trial, looking at weekly testing, significantly further behind that of the 74% weekly. Keeping in mind the Bloomfield 21 study analysis and the Thinners trial were very well-controlled trials, and they significantly trailed that of real-world patient self-testing with weekly. The next slide, this defines what critical values are and the significance of hospital readmissions. As we all know, including and especially VAD, that readmission rates in the first 30 days are fairly common. They tend to parallel that of CHAD scores of the severity of the patient and concomitant disease states and other medications. You can see that at 1.5 and 5, I've put color codes in there to show the incidence of readmission rates goes significantly. So we felt that that surrogate marker of critical values would be a good endpoint for us to prevent readmission, but not go so far out where it was too late to include those patients. The next slide, these results of critical values, you can see the significance, and it's somewhat logical that if you test more frequently, you may not be in target range, but you will certainly catch trends sooner than later. And I think that sums up this slide fairly well. The weekly testing incidence of critical values for that 4,500 patient database for 2.5 years was 2.33%, and the variable group was almost 50% higher at 4.61%. So this, I think, speaks volumes in terms of improving patient safety on warfarin by paying attention to testing frequency. Time and target range by itself is not a good marker for warfarin control, because you could conceivably be in range 100% of the time during the month, but if you spend 60 or 70% of that time and range outside of your target range in a critical view, you would not be considered well controlled, and you could conceivably have a adverse event, even though by monthly connecting the dots, you'd be in range 100% of the time. So this, I think, is a good additional surrogate marker for warfarin control, adding critical value to therapeutic time and range, or TTR. And below, I just put this in terms of relativity. The hemorrhagic risk in INR of 4 doubles your risk of a bleeding event. In INR of 6, 7 times, sevenfold. So you can see the 5 would be somewhere in the middle there, maybe 5 times the risk of hemorrhagic event. While you may not be actively bleeding, you're certainly on your way to that and toward a readmission. So, and on the thrombotic side, a little bit more favorable. But an INR of 1.7 doubles the risk of a thrombotic event, and 1.4, 4 times that of risk. So these are published data, and I think they're very valuable to use going forward for future clinical studies, and we still use this metric for all of our future clinical reporting measures. The next slide, this one is this also comes directly from the journal published in Time to Critical Value. I would draw your attention to the left text, the mean time to critical value. It merely shows that when warfarin is really well at greater than 60%, it takes over 18 and a half months to hit that critical value. Whereas if you're less than 60%, that critical value creeps up very quickly at little over 4 months. And knowing the association between risk of thrombotic events and hemorrhagic events, those are significant numbers, 18.7 and 4.4%. So testing frequency, very important, obviously well-controlled warfarin, equally important in terms of encountering that first event of critical value. The next slide, one of the criteria, one of the objectives, if you will, for the stable study was to see if age was a restrictive parameter for offering warfarin for patients, and maybe newer agents be more appropriate in those patients. So we looked at time and range by age. We broke it down by those brackets you can see in the maroon rectangle there, and it really showed that this data dispels 50 years of myth that older patients in the 70s, 80s, 90 and 100 years old can do extremely well on warfarin if it's well managed. And 38% of our entire patients for the stable study were older than 75 years old. And these patients obviously represent your typical higher CHAD score, so their incidence of strokes and bleedings are naturally higher. So it is more difficult to manage a high time and target range and low critical value incident. But you can see in the red numbers in parentheses opposite each age brackets. That warfarin was extremely well controlled in patients 75 to 80 years old, and even patients that were as high as 105 years old in our study still averaged about 70% time in range, and that exceeds all previous clinical trials because most of those trials did not use a structured weekly testing which to offer patients warfarin. So dispelling that myth was very important as stroke incidence tends to obviously increase as patients get older. So it looks as if warfarin management provided with good structured testing frequency may very well be to future therapy. The next slide, this shows again graphically a little bit easier to see both the controlled trials of the 21 meta-analysis of Bloomfield and the Thinners trial at the VA significantly trailed in most age groups. So it does show that real-world warp control with patient self-testing is a viable and looks to be perhaps an emerging standard of care for patients. So that was just reinforces the previous data slide. The slide, we wanted to see if this control could be sustained over the course of the trial. So one of our markers was to not only identify critical milestones based on months of being in the study, but could it be sustained? And the good news again here was that both arms were controlled very well, and it looks as if weekly exceeded that of variable in every case, and even more so at early therapy, which is when most of the side effects occur. The maroon box that's in the rectangle there, that represents 5 trials of new agents, finding out when is warfarin not as effective or not as safe as some of the new agents like Pradaxa, Xarelto, Edoxaban, and Apixaban. And this box represents the range of time and target range needed to make these new drugs either comparable or superior to warfarin. So while we all listen to the prime time commercials for Pradaxa and Xarelto about how these are safer drugs for intracranial hemorrhage and other side effects, none of those trials incorporated self-testing at all, much less weekly self-testing, when it shows to be the most efficacious and safest method in which to move forward with warfarin. So you can see that weekly testing exceeded all of the 5 trials, independent trials of warfarin cost effectiveness. So in terms of drug cost and adherence to drug, looks like warfarin, when it's in a weekly testing, may be, as I said, an emerging new standard of care. In conclusion, as I wrap up with about 3-4 minutes to go, the conclusions: optimal warfarin control was significantly improved by testing frequency, 74% for weekly. The control of warfarin was not limited by indication of why you were taking warfarin, whether it's valve, DVT, PE, MI, or atrial fibrillation. We did not have any or very few patients with VAD, so we'd like to perhaps address that in future studies. And reimbursement remains, unfortunately, restricted to patients on warfarin for greater than 90 days. That is still not covered for warfarin reimbursed through Medicare. The next slide talks about the future of oral anticoagulation. The next slide after that, entitled The Future of Oral Anticoagulation, if you can pull that up. The quote here, I think, is simple but brilliant. We don't need more effective therapies. We need more effective means of delivering current available therapies to patients who would benefit from it. This comes from Dr. Alan Jacobson out at Linda VA. He was one of the principal investigators for the Thinners trial. And the profile below, I put here the perfect anticoagulant, irrespective of who you work for or what taking it for would have to include. Have to be safe and effectiveness, and that would tend to fall under probably equal between warfarin and the new agents. When you look at absolute benefit of these new agents, they're only 7% different than warfarin. From a relative standpoint, they're increasing. There's a greater increase, but from an absolute difference, in terms of what matters most to patients, there's only a 0.7 difference between safety and efficacy of warfarin than any of the new agents. Reversibility with vitamin K for warfarin, it's relatively easy or easier than new agents because dialysis looks to only, or letting the drug run its course looks to be the only reversible agents for new agents. So certainly warfarin has the edge in terms of reversibility. Affordability now with warfarin at 13 cents a day, whether it be Walmart or Target, there's 90-day prescriptions for $10 or 90-day coverage for $10. So warfarin has the edge. The new $6 to $9 a day for co-pays for the new agents. Warfarin's easily monitored, which is huge for patient adherence. None of these new agents have any way of measuring adherence, and they're all short-acting, so that's a significant concern for patients that need protection that's uninterrupted. And you'd have to give the edge to newer agents in terms of practicality. They are cleaner, they don't interact with vitamin A, and they have much fewer drug-drug interactions than warfarin. But overall, warfarin, as much as you love to hate it, it hangs in there in many of the important categories for practicality in terms of wide-scale use of current underutilization for prophylactics of oral anticoagulation. The next slide, and my last slide, and I'll open to questions. We are continuing to undergo discussion with Medicare. I just had a call yesterday with two of the national coverage decision makers for Medicare, and we addressed this letter that came back to Jack Ansell that says that there's not enough evidence yet in the database to expand reimbursement for patients that are on the drug from initiation all the way up to the 90th day, even though that's the most volatile time for readmissions and the most costly time. So the call yesterday went extremely well. I won't get into the details because time is running out, and I want to leave time for questions and answers. That may include this data as well. So before I go any further, I'll just wrap up and say next slide is just thank you for having me. I appreciate your attention, and I'll entertain questions you have, both on the stable trial and any steps going forward with Medicare.
Gary, can you hear me?
There we go.
Yes, I can.
Well, that was a phenomenal presentation. It was very compelling, and I'm so glad you shared it with us. There's just a bunch of very wonderful data there. What, as VAD coordinators and people who live our lives inside the VAD world, very interested in seeing how we would get enough data with VAD patients to have VAD as an indication, in and of it, a freestanding indication, as opposed to, what we're doing right now is if a patient goes into AFib for 10 minutes, we're like, grab that AFib, that'll do it.
Yeah.
So,
I think, if you look at the pattern of Medicare, the first coverage decision was in 2002. That included mechanical heart valves only. And you could say it was a good decision because they are the most thrombogenic patients out there with the mechanical heart valves in their chest. That's the logic side of it, but we all know Medicare is not logical. They're evidence-based and they're tough to move. So it took 10 clinical trials with mechanical heart valves for them to say we're going to approve this national coverage decision for all mechanical heart valves, irrespective of the control of warfarin. It took about 8 years later for enough fibrillation trials to be conducted, looking at patient self-testing as an alternative entity for managing the drug. Then in 2008, they finally said we have enough information to make that decision. My discussion yesterday with Medicare was there's not enough time nor money to do 10 clinical trials for VAD, but this is an extremely thrombogenic group as well, and while it represents a relatively small percentage of total indications of drug, this is something, you got to be careful of your words, not as an oversight to not include them, but certainly one that we'd be interested in opening a dialogue with them. So would you be willing to look at ventricular assist device warfarin control data with self-testing? And the answer was positively yes. So my final comments to you and to your group is Alira will be actively looking at data with patient testing to parallel some of the other previous trials that Medicare has looked on. And that would be, when do you start? How well was warfarin controlled? What were the critical values and what were the readmission rates for VAD patients? So I think assembling that type of data, that we have an open door to CMS with Dr. Rollins, Dr. Roche, who are the two clinicians that make these coverage decisions, and we have a national coverage decision specific that's open to this, expanding warfarin indications from 0 to 90 days. So we do have a NDC number already that's open. So I really have to begin to work with folks like yourself and others and I am for other indications of DVT valves and atrial fibrillation to consolidate that data, presented in a that Medicare will look at favorably.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much for being an advocate for patients that are near and dear to our hearts. It's 12:30. I think that was an incredibly invigorating journal club. Thank you very much. And Gary, should people listen to this that weren't able to ask questions, and if they reach out to Dawn or reach out to myself, would you be willing to field questions in the future?
Yeah, I would, and I'd be happy to provide sub-analysis with data as well. Please open those questions to you and you forward them on to me. I'll send them back to you, so if you want to broadcast those answers so it doesn't go just back to the questionnaire, then everybody could benefit from it.
Great. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal.
Sure.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.